shock. The return of Mrs. Rubini to the hospital was a black mark on the record of Zolfax. It wasn't the drug's fault. It was the stubborn insistence of the patient not to use the drug, not to get the prescription filled, and not to stay in contact with her handlers at the hospital. The courier who slushed the runner in her vestibule was in therapy, and there were scars on his abdomen. It was unreasonable for Mrs. Rubini to isolate herself from medication and treatment, or so Percy thought as she unloaded in the donut shop at her semi-regular meeting with Will. Mrs. Rubini's status in the community was the occasion for an early morning meeting between Percy, Dr. Singh, and a group of specialists at the hospital. Percy had asked to be kept abreast of significant changes involving Mrs. Rubini. She wanted her extracurricular endeavor at the hospital to span a year. A year was a significant investment. It would look very good on future applications. But when she and her mother agreed to the one-year framework, they never conceived of a circumstance in which the patient would be so erratic after months of treatment. They thought there would just be a few more reports to fill out, a simple procedural conclusion to a voluntary one-year study. Percy had a full school load with her graduate studies. Not to mention she was with child, and Mrs. Rubini was never meant to be this much work. "Why don't you just forget about it?" Will said. "How can I do that?" Percy asked. Will had no answer. Things had moved from bad to worse. When the administration becomes acquainted with a patient, the administration has a responsibility, not only to the patient, but to society at large. Failure to pay for and take your drugs was a breach of the sacred trust between the administration of health and the ailed party. Mrs. Rubini had ratcheted up the mental health process to an impromptu meeting at 9 a.m., interfering with Percy's studies. The topic of discussion had been electric shock therapy. "They still do that?" Will asked. "Oh yeah," Percy said. "Electric shock therapy is still used." It sent a shiver down Will's spine. The administration was leaning towards shocking the old woman into doing what she had been told to do. There was a legal representative from the drug company at the meeting. He wore a dark pinstriped suit and sat away from the board table. The drug company had a stake in the process as well. After all, they had sponsored the treatment by making their drug available. Countless millions, even billions of dollars went into research and development for new pharmaceuticals, and they watched the approval and testing process very carefully. They were the eyes and ears of researchers, clinicians, government agencies, and, not least among the coterie, stakeholders in the publicly traded drug companies. They went over Percy's notes. Everything was being read aloud. It was a close scrutiny of her summer months of due diligence with Mrs. Rubini and 3 other patients she had been given to supervise. Words had hung in the air: complacent, docile, unresponsive, agreeable. And these words had the power to send one of nature's most mysterious and truly undefined forces, electricity, through the brain of a 64-year-old woman. Dr. Singh had the nervous habit of playing with the keys to his new Bavarian Motorworks automobile when he was in meetings with people from the senior hospital administration. His fingers rolled over the shiny little phallus again and again, but he was careful not to allow it to become too much of a distraction. He had looked like he was trying to hypnotize himself. He had spoken often about the car to Percy when he first leased it in the summer. He had thought about the 700 series, but the lease payments were a bit prohibitive. A 500 series was completely respectable. It was a solid piece of German engineering. He played with the keys to his new car while discussing. The pinstripe suit from the drug company sat off near the corner of the small boardroom, but his physical exclusion didn't mean the exclusion of his opinion, and when he spoke, they listened. His voice was incantory. Everything he said had meaning, and the meaning was always liability, degree of liability, perception of liability, and liability compensation. His was one of the most potent opinions in the room. In most circumstances in life, the person writing the checks has an important say in things. The flow of capital is the flow of opportunity, Will said, trying to contribute to the conversation. Percy gave him an odd look. Percy had been quiet at the meeting. She was not expected to participate unless she was asked to do so. She was only a new graduate student after all, not a doctor. It was a privilege for her to be in the meeting. An exceptional learning opportunity, her mother had said. The point that kept coming up again and again around the table was accountability. The senior administrators made sure that it was never far from the discussion. The hospital had become aware of Mrs. Rubini, and now that it was aware of her, it had a responsibility to a public that might suffer the consequences of another surprise attack. This could lead to a lawsuit if the victim came into the knowledge that the attacker had been treated by the public health system and had been known to the authorities to have a history of spontaneous violence. The chances of this happening, the senior hospital administrators assured the board table, were remote. The family had been of no assistance. Her husband was unable to assume responsibility for her care. He could not bring himself to force medication upon his wife if she didn't want it. They were unable to convince him otherwise, despite the warnings of measures that could go into place to make sure his wife took her medication. The warnings fell on deaf ears. The husband would not give her the medication. The situation and its rhetoric had made Percy's head spin. She had begun to feel sick in the stomach. She placed her hand over the small protrusion in her abdomen, barely visible when she was naked and impossible to detect when she was clothed. She had not told the hospital that she was pregnant. She had not told anybody but Will. While in the meeting at the hospital, she had a sudden and violent spasm in her stomach. She had been getting sick most mornings of her first trimester. She had placed her hand over her mouth and a small amount of vomit came up and through her fingers and onto the boardroom table. She stood and said, "Oh my God, please excuse me." Percy sat silent. Will sipped his coffee, then offered whatever comfort he could muster. He told her that the Indians used to leave the old and the infirm on islands alone in the winter when they could no longer keep up with the movements of the tribe. "How did that heal them?" Percy asked. "They were left there to die," Will said. "Every economy has boundaries on compassion." "Indians," Percy said. "Fucking Indians." End of chapter.